Boldwood presents The Shadow on the Bridge, written by Clare Marchant and read by Helen Stern. Chapter 1, 1569. Dinner was almost over, and I was attempting to conceal my boredom, putting my hand over my mouth as I yawned. Further down the table, my grandmother frowned at me and shook her head slightly. She was more conscious of the civil rules I should be abiding by, although I cared little if I appeared rude. Our stepfather, the Duke of Norfolk, was visiting, and this required us all, myself and my 3 younger siblings, to attend dinner with him, during which he ignored us anyway. After our father, Lord Greystoke, died, his fortune and estates were entailed to my younger brother George, who was then just 5 years old. Fiscally compromised, our mother had married the Duke in haste, but less than 2 years later, she died in childbirth, the babe with her. Subsequently, we had been dispatched, together with our maternal grandmother, to live here at Barnham Cross Hall, an old converted convent in Norfolk, where we had been for these past 2 years. It had few of the opulent comforts of Arundel Castle, where we'd lived previously, or even Greystoke Castle in Cumberland, where we'd all been born, the ancestral home of our father, and now awaiting George to come of age and inherit. He too was now bored and restless, and I couldn't help smiling at him, his jerkin askew as he fidgeted and squirmed on his seat. With no mother, and our poor grandmother too old to keep his manners much constrained, it fell to me to look after him, and teach him as best as I knew what would be required of him, given he was now the 9th Baron Greystoke. It seemed our grandmother could contain him no longer, because with a flash of his dark green breeches, George slipped away from the table and out of the door. I slid my eyes towards the Duke, but he didn't seem to have noticed, and I breathed a sigh of relief. If he thought my brother ill-behaved, he may well decide to send him away to live with another family, as was customary, so he could be taught the ways of a nobleman. It would surely happen at some point, but I was not ready to see him go yet. I'd barely taken 2 mouthfuls of the cinnamon custard in my dish when there was a hideous scream, followed by a crash from the gallery above us. It was where George's most prized possession, his huge, life-size rocking horse, Hal, lived. Jumping to my feet, I ran to the stairs as the rest of the household followed. The Duke took the stairs 2 at a time, but I was fleet of foot and arrived at the terrible scene first. As he caught up with me, the merest wash of a grim smile flushed across the Duke's face, and then it was gone. George lay on the floor, a pool of blood spreading around his head in every direction, flooding the floor. His eyes were open and staring, but his head was at an impossible angle, and I knew immediately that he was looking at nothing, for there was no life left within him. His thin legs in their green were still tangled up with Hal, where the horse also lay on the floor, and I could see that one of its front legs was no longer attached to the torso. I had to step over it to reach George, where I dropped to my knees. The space was filled with a horrendous noise, a roaring, screaming sound, and I wished it would just stop. Then I realized it was coming from me, carrying on as though it may never end. Someone was trying to pull me away, but I resisted, lifting George's head onto my knees so I might cradle it there. The light through the tall gallery tracery windows, still in place from the convent days, fell in a shaft of brilliance to illuminate a halo around his head. A halo for a fallen soldier, just as my brother used to pretend to be as he rode his horse. The metallic smell of the blood rose in my face, and I could taste sweet cinnamon in my mouth, as the food I'd just eaten threatened to rise up my throat. Hands beneath my armpits pulled me away, and from my prone position I watched as our steward, Richard, scooped George up and bore him away, drops of blood leaving a trail behind him. His sightless eyes did not leave mine, as though imploring me to do something to save him. It was too late now. I clambered to my feet, not easy in my heavy, now blood-stained gown. I could see my stepfather, the Duke, standing to one side. And as I watched, he wordlessly held his hand out, and a person I did not recognize dropped 2 wooden pegs into it. He slipped them into his pocket and strode away towards his private rooms. I looked at the horse again, and with a sudden flare of lucidity, I understood what had just happened. Hal's leg was no longer attached to the rest of the horse because the pins had been removed. Now I knew I could see they were missing. It had been deliberately sabotaged so that George would fall. My spirited, mischievous 8-year-old brother had just been murdered, killed at the behest of our stepfather. Why on earth had he ordered such a heinous thing? The hall remained in mourning for the following month. My mood alternated between heart-sore, abject sorrow because our brother was gone, and a white-hot fury because I knew the truth. It was no accident. My grandmother kept to her rooms, only appearing for the funeral. A quiet and small affair, it was held in the chapel, which was once a part of the convent, and afterwards he was buried in the cemetery alongside the nuns. My sisters didn't attend, and they'd been kept in the nursery since. I was expected to remain with them, but I ignored my orders, instead stalking the corridors, hiding in shadows to listen to conversations I was not supposed to be privy to, searching for answers. I found them 6 weeks after my brother's death, when I was resting on a window seat in the gallery, gazing down at the kitchen garden below. A young lad was digging up onions, and I almost raised a smile when he picked one up and, swinging it around his head by the leafy top, hurled it at a maid who was picking flowers and laying them carefully in a basket she carried. With his perfect shot, the onion hit her on the bottom. She placed the basket on the floor and turned to see who had thrown it. Although I could not hear her remonstrate, I could tell from the way her hands were folded in front of her she was most displeased. And then, to my delight, she swung the onion round and threw it back at him, making him dodge out of the way to avoid being hit. Life went on, even though for me it couldn't. The gallery was where I felt closest to George. The floor where Hal once stood now had dimples in the floorboards, where the heavy horse's rockers had damaged it. That day, I was obscured by the thick embroidered drapes hanging at the window, so wasn't spotted by the Duke and one of his men as they entered, talking in low voices. "Are you sure this is truly so?" the Duke asked. "Everything must go to his sisters, the Cumberland estate, and the fortune too. They will be very rich when they inherit, and I absolutely must have those lands. So close to Scotland, they are of huge strategic value, not just to me, to others who would also wish them. The boy is dead, and yet I still do not have what I want. Unfortunately, then, there's more work to be done." He walked from the gallery towards the stairs, and I waited until I was certain they were gone before I climbed from my hiding space. My suspicions were correct. Our stepfather had ordered that Hal was tampered with to create an accident which would kill my brother, and I just overheard his motive for doing so. He wanted the Greystoke estate for its position so close to Scotland and all the money that came with it, which had now reverted to myself and my sisters. A sour acid burned in my chest as I stood where George's blood still stained the floor when it had pooled in the dips Hal's rockers once rested in. A week later, carts were being loaded with the Duke's belongings as he readied to move on elsewhere. It was what he did, spend his time either at court with his cousin the Queen or travel around his many homes. He rarely came to Barnham Cross Hall, and I hoped fervently he never had reason to do so again. But I would make him pay for what he did, however long it took. Just as the final carriages rolled away, I was summoned to his rooms. He was wearing a travelling cloak and sitting beside the fire, his long legs stretched out before him in tall, shining leather riding boots. I walked in and stopped in front of him, my legs shaking, but my knees locked straight as I refused to curtsy. There was a long pause as he expected this sign of reverence, but he would be waiting a long time, for I held no respect for him. The silence lengthened until eventually he cleared his throat and got to his feet. "Anne, I have been giving some thought to your marriage," he said. Now I could not keep my counsel. "My lord, you seem to have forgotten that I am but 12 years old, too young to be wed. Perhaps if you had visited us more often, you might have known that." "I am aware of your age," he snapped. "You shall be betrothed to my eldest son, Philip, the heir to all I possess. My riches and lands will one day be his, and you will be Lady Howard. A much exalted place to be. I'm sure even you can appreciate that. Your sisters will also be betrothed later to my other 2 sons, William and Thomas. And I will manage your fortunes until you all come of age." "I shall not have it," I hissed through my teeth, and I watched his face as a red stain rose up from his neck until his face was a deep scarlet with suppressed anger. "I shall choose my own husband when I am ready, just as my own parents would have wished, and I do not bestow on you permission to touch our inheritance." Even as the words left my lips, I knew I had no means to stop him. "I am your guardian." The Duke got to his feet so he could look down on me, a threatening position as I was forced to tip my head back and look up at him. I was painfully aware of how exposed my throat was to someone who only weeks before had so blithely arranged the murder of my sibling. "No man may marry you without coming to ask my permission, and it will never be given. As your protector, it is for me to choose who you will wed, and I have done so. There'll be a small betrothal ceremony as soon as it can be arranged, and then a marriage ceremony when you are 14. Without another word, he strode from the room, almost knocking me off my feet as he swept past and knocked my shoulder, and I staggered to the chair he'd just vacated and sank into it. I thought my life could not get any worse, and yet now it had. I would be tied to him forever until he was dead. I looked across at the doorway he'd just walked through. "You must forever watch your back." I spoke the words clearly, as though he might be standing outside the door listening, although I knew he wasn't. I could hear shouts in the courtyard where he was mounting his horse, preparing to leave. Come what may, I shall avenge my brother's death. Chapter 2, 2025. Sarah pulled in to allow the car approaching her to cross the narrow bridges. She could sense the house away to her left, its gloomy facade seeming to block out the sunlight, watching and waiting. For her. It had taken 21 years, but now, finally, it had drawn her back. She'd spent several weeks trying to think of a reason to not accept the request to visit, but in the end, she couldn't find the words for the reply she really wanted to send. Cordelia's letter had hinted at dire circumstances, and Sarah felt the heavy weight of obligation. Nobody else would go. She knew that. And that her godmother, her father's second cousin, wouldn't have asked her, unless nobody else would suffice. Nevertheless, the effort it had taken to pack a suitcase, a small one, she didn't intend staying a moment longer than necessary, and let her neighbour know she was going away, had been exhausting. But here she was, having just driven through Thetford, and in a moment she'd go over those 3 bridges spanning the place where the 2 rivers, the Thet and Ouse, converged. The nuns' bridges. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she slowly moved forwards. Now she'd arrived, she just wanted to carry on driving, to be anywhere other than here. But she was expected, and however hard this would be, she knew she'd turn left after the 3rd bridge and follow the track to the large, imposing iron gates, hung on old brick pillars, at the entrance to her godmother's home. A building which had started life in the 14th century as a convent, and following the Reformation, had been gifted to the 4th Duke of Norfolk, who'd subsequently converted it into a house. It had been added to later by the Georgians, and despite its size and faded grandeur, for many years it had been a place of sanctuary. Now, though, for Sarah, it was just a place where her sunny childhood memories ended. The gates were open, one of them leaning slightly askew, and, judging by the amount of grass and weeds crawling up and weaving their way through, they hadn't been closed for some time. Sarah frowned. That wasn't going to help with security. The least she could do while she was there would be to arrange for someone to clear the ground and repair and repaint the rusty iron. The drive was in a similar state. The centre a small mountain range of ridges and tall goosefoot grass, which caught on the chassis of her car and made her wince, hoping she wouldn't leave her exhaust on the drive behind her. Pulling up outside the house, she parked next to a blue Mini, whilst to one side sat a gleaming orange motorbike. As she got out of the car and stretched her back, tight after hours of driving, there was nowhere else to look but up at the stern facade of the house. It was no longer inviting, nor did it exude the warmth it once did. Her heart beat hard in her chest, and she bit her lower lip as tears formed in the corners of her eyes. It looked exactly the same as it did when it came to her in the dark hours of night. The awful, violent dreams which still interrupted her sleep all these years later. The ivy across the front had definitely grown, now almost obscuring some of the upper windows. But the huge wooden front door, studded with iron bolts and held to the frame with thick, black 2-foot-long hinges, was exactly the same. The dense, weathered wood had kept out those who were not permitted to enter for 800 years. She wished it would refuse her now. Someone must have been watching out for her, even though when she telephoned, she'd only confirmed the day she was arriving, not the time. It had been a long drive from Cornwall, and yet in front of her the door, groaning at having to move when it clearly rarely did, swung open, revealing a small woman wearing faded jeans and a t-shirt bearing the slogan, "I incite this meeting to rebellion." "Sarah?" she asked, opening the door wider. "I'm Amanda, Cordelia's housekeeper. Come on in. She's been on tenterhooks waiting for you. She seemed dubious that you'd turn up, although I did tell her she was being ridiculous." Cordelia knew her only too well, Sarah thought, as she stepped through the porch and from there into the hall. It was all exactly as she remembered it. The umbrella stand in the corner was still there, although it no longer contained the 2 umbrellas which used to reside in it. Beneath her feet, the old flagstones looked as though they'd recently been given a sweep. Inside, the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. She gave a shiver and swallowed hard. The musty smell of dust, damp, and ancient stone mixed with old leather furnishings and heavy silk floor-length curtains washed over her in an unexpected wave of melancholy. The sound of her feet as she walked echoed around them before scattering into the distance, down corridors snaking away from where she was standing. All achingly familiar, despite her wish to forget it all. This wasn't designed as a home, and nor did it feel like one. The hall in which she now stood had originally been part of the chapel, stripped of all its religious artifacts after the Reformation, but still with a magnificent vaulted ceiling, coloured bosses marking each of the intersections of the carved wooden beams. Thankfully, it seemed they'd been too high up for the 16th century vandals to desecrate. The windows along the front wall still retained a few of the original stained glass panes, through which the light outside now filtered in around the ivy, leaving flickering movements of dancing colour on the flagstone flooring. She was sure, despite the intervening centuries, that she could still smell remnants of incense. This part of the house felt every bit as foreboding as it ever had. It was always cold here, the air hung with the prayers of centuries and the unseen nuns who once knelt here and offered their souls to God. Beneath her feet, some of the slabs, uneven and worn down by centuries of people passing over them, bore inscriptions dedicated to the ancient custodians of the building. Out of habit, she stepped over them. Sarah followed Amanda towards the back of the house. There was still no mention of why she'd been summoned, but she assumed at some point everything would be explained. And it would need to be a good reason. Through another heavy wooden door in the far corner, they walked into the bright and sunny Georgian extension to the rear of the hall. Even as a child, she'd always preferred this part of the house. But now, as an adult, Sarah realised how incongruous it was. No planning official these days would allow something so out of place to be added haphazardly on the back of such an ancient building. From this still lofty, albeit brighter inner space, lay the drawing and dining rooms, and also a corridor leading back to the kitchens, which, with the other formal rooms, were all in the old part of the building. Amanda waved her hand towards the drawing room. "She's in there. You go in and say hello, and I'll make a pot of tea. I expect you're parched." "Thank you. I am," Sarah replied. She opened the door slowly, feeling it catch on the thick Aubusson carpet, and walked in. Her legs were shaking as though they may give way at any moment, but she'd come this far. She couldn't back out now. The room looked different, but that was hardly a surprise after so long. The pale, faded pink walls and green moiré silk curtains with their dusty swags were the same, the fabric no longer shining as it once had, and the wide marble fireplace was exactly as it was. But most of the elegant furniture had been replaced by a modern corner sofa unit, a wing-back chair, and sitting on top of what appeared to be a mahogany bow-fronted Victorian chest of drawers, a widescreen television showing a quiz show. "Is that you, Sarah?" A voice instantly so familiar came from the chair, and she hurried across, putting her misgivings at being there out of her mind just for a moment. "Yes, it's me. Hello." She tried to keep her voice steady as she bent down to kiss the old lady on the cheek. The scent of Chanel No. 5 wafted up to meet her, instantly so familiar. But that was the only thing she recognised in her godmother. The tall, robust woman who'd always looked as though she'd just arrived from an army parade ground and who spoke as if she was commanding troops was now a small, wizened old lady with sunken cheeks. Her skin was thin and pale yellow, and her hair, once thick and dark, was now sparse and white. Sarah tried not to gasp or show her shock, although she was sure her face was displaying her emotions. "Hello." Her voice came out in a whisper as she tried to gather herself together. "Long time no see," she added, immediately regretting saying something so thoughtless. She was as guilty of their infrequent communication over the past decade as Cordelia was. "Hello yourself, my darling," came the reply. "Sit yourself down," she said, waving towards the big sofa. "That thing is a monstrosity, but the springs and horsehair were coming out of the old Chesterfield, and as Amanda sits in here with me in the evenings, I insisted we got her something more comfortable. She chose it. I hate it, but I don't have to sit on it, so I'm thankful for that." Sarah perched on the front of the nearest seat. She agreed it didn't fit with the aesthetic of the room, but that old sofa had indeed been extremely uncomfortable even back when she used to visit, so goodness knows what it was like in more recent years. "She seems nice. She's just making us some tea." Sarah could hear her voice babbling on like the rivers outside, unable to stop. "I couldn't do without her. She's such a help. Cook, cleaner, nurse, general dog's body. Although, don't tell her I said that." Cordelia smiled to herself. Before either of them could say any more, they were interrupted by a quiet knock on the door, and, as promised, Amanda arrived with a tray bearing a teapot, 2 mugs, and a plate of rich tea biscuits. Some things never changed, Sarah noted. The same importance of using a teapot, although thankfully the bone china cups and saucers were no longer there, possibly long since broken. "I'll leave you to pour," Amanda told Sarah. "Dinner's at 6:30. Bring your suitcases in when you're ready and come and find me in the kitchen. I'll show you which room you're in." "Thank you." Sarah's voice caught in her throat. "Please, God, don't let it be the same one." She turned and poured 2 cups of Earl Grey and offered the biscuits to Cordelia, who took one and broke it in half before putting both bits back on the tray. "I'm glad you came," she said. "To be honest, I didn't think you would, and I wouldn't have blamed you, not one bit. I appreciate how hard it must be, coming back here after all this time. I can't lie. I wanted to turn the car around 100 times, Sarah admitted, especially when I had to drive over the bridges. Her voice faltered for a moment, and she took a deep breath to try and stop the wobble she could hear as well as feel. She mustn't let her guard down, or there'd be no stopping her emotions, bound so tightly inside. First time is always the hardest. I hope when you've heard what I have to tell you, you'll feel less anxious that you came. She took a mouthful of tea, an audible clunk as she swallowed it echoing around the room, before taking a deep breath. I don't have long to live. Perhaps 6 months, maybe less. That's why I now have Amanda here to help me. Anyway, I'm not going to beat about the bush. I've left you this place in my will. She held her hand up, anticipating an interruption. Wait till I've finished before you say anything. Sarah, who had indeed opened her mouth, shut it again. What happened all those years ago wasn't your fault, and I feel huge remorse at what happened, how the fallout has echoed down the years. It seems you've spent your life in hiding, and I'm guessing that's why you don't now have a husband or a family of your own. The few times we've corresponded, you've always told me how much you enjoy your illustrating work. But how are you going to meet people when you work on your own? You can't keep blaming yourself for that summer. You were just a child. When I've gone, lay those ghosts to rest and come back to live here. Take your finger off the pause button to your life. You of all people know how precious it is, how quickly it can be snatched away. There, I've said my bit. I actually asked you here now because the house is full of my personal belongings. I don't want anyone rummaging through my memories when I'm gone. I'd like you to help me sort everything out before I head off into the afterlife. Will you do that for me, please? Finally, Sarah was allowed to speak, but when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. Nobody spoke of what had happened, and now in one fell swoop, Cordelia had taken the lid off Pandora's box. And also told her she was to inherit the one place in the entire world she didn't want nor would ever live in. Will you? Sarah realized Cordelia was waiting for an answer. There was only one she could give, despite the fact that with her whole being she wanted to refuse. Yes. Yes, I'll stay and help. And thank you, but I don't want this place. Leave it to the cat's home or wherever. Cordelia laughed. We can discuss that part of the deal later. I hope by the end of the summer you'll have changed your mind. This place gets under your skin. Surely you can remember that. Sarah nodded. It did. It had once been the fairy tale palace of her dreams. But not now. Chapter 3 1571 I stood perfectly still as I had been instructed, my arms out to each side. Just for once I was quiet, my teeth biting my lower lip, stopping the words from escaping. My foot was tapping as I sought release for the anxiety coursing through my body. Already my head was hurting from the number of pins used to hold my hair in place. Strings of pearls and round cabochon emeralds, gifts from my stepfather, Thomas Howard, the 4th Duke of Norfolk, were woven through the intricate arrangement. In less than an hour, that man would also be my father-in-law. Nearly finished, my dear Anne, my maid Kate said. She was more than a maid, but my companion too. Ever since I'd seen her remonstrate with a garden boy about a thrown onion, I knew she had a spirit to match my own, and she could be a friend in a world where few could be trusted. She tied the white silk sleeves, gathered into little pleats and stitched with yet more pearls, to the pale yellow stomacher I was wearing, the ribbons flicking in and out of the eyelets as she worked. My insides were hurting, and I didn't know if it was nerves or the tight garments, which barely left room for me to breathe. On the bed lay a dark green velvet gown, embroidered with tiny lilac flowers. Already I felt weighed down, not only by the heavy clothes, but also with the burden and emotion this day brought. My stepbrother Philip and I had already wed 2 years previously, but that ceremony was a formality due to my age. Now at 14, I was considered old enough to properly take my vows. 2 years my senior, Philip would shortly leave for Cambridge to study there, and I would join my father-in-law at his London home. It meant leaving my younger sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, with our grandmother at Barnham Cross Hall, where it stood beside the convergence of the rivers Thet and Ouse, as they met in bubbling, foaming fury, over which the 3 bridges of Icknield Way spanned the water. Whenever there was heavy rain, the waters rose and flooded the area. Despite its raw bleakness, it had become my home, a place with memories made with my siblings, the last remaining years of my childhood before I would be thrust into my new life, that of court, and, I had no doubt, subtleties and behaviours I'd struggle to understand. "There, you look beautiful." Kate interrupted my thoughts as she stood back to admire her handiwork before holding out the gown for me to slip my arms into. Despite needing last-minute alterations, it still swamped my diminutive figure. I would have to walk slowly to prevent myself standing on the hem and falling flat on my face. I could only imagine the Duke's displeasure should that happen. Kate threw her arms around me and squeezed tight. "It's your wedding day," she whispered, "and you are marrying a fine, handsome lad. Put aside your misgivings for today and enjoy everything." I hugged her back, thankful again for her friendship and insight. During the years she'd worked for me, she'd grown to know me almost as well as I knew myself, and I couldn't deny that her description of my husband-to-be was correct. "Thank you, my friend," I spoke into her ear as I returned her hug. Outside the room, I could hear the bickering voices of my sisters, who were overexcited that we were all at the magnificent castle of Arundel for the nuptials. They couldn't remember living there with Mamma. They'd been barely more than babes in arms. "Are you ready?" My grandmother, also resplendent in a new gown, walked in. The Duke had ensured we were all dressed appropriate to our station for this auspicious occasion, even though he cared not how we lived at Barnham Cross Hall. "Your sisters are fighting over who carries which end of the bower, so it may be prudent for us to make our way to the chapel now, before someone's new dress is ruined." Yes, I suppose so. I didn't need to disguise my desolation at the situation. In front of my grandmother, there was no requirement to sound happy or excited, for she understood how much this day pained me. Leaving my family was breaking my heart, but we both knew I had no choice. Since the death of our mother 4 years ago, my siblings and I had been under the guardianship of the Duke, and what he wanted, he got. That had been made palpably, horribly clear when George had been made a pawn in the chessboard of our lives. The man was a tyrant, and for the rest of my days, I would labour to see him pay for his terrible deed. Chapter 4, 2004. "Mummy, Mummy! Sarah won't help me with my bag, and it's too heavy." Emily's whining voice was already beginning to get on Sarah's nerves. She'd managed to make the word "too" last for about 30 seconds. Rolling her eyes, Sarah lifted the case from the back of the car, earning her a ruffle of her hair and a conspiratorial wink from her father. Emily's headstrong nature was silently acknowledged, as was her own tendency to comply with her demands in exchange for a quiet life. At 10, Emily was younger by just 18 months, and yet Sarah felt a decade older in her attitude. "Let me help you, darling." A large, freckly hand took the case from her, and Sarah looked up into the smiling face of her godmother, Cordelia. The sun was still high, and it shone behind her, making her dark hair, now shot through with glimmering silver grey, glow like a halo. Cordelia, a distant cousin, was hers and hers alone, Not Emily's godmother, someone she didn't have to share with her sister like she did with everything else. And she knew she was the apple of childless Cordelia's eye. Eavesdropping one day, Sarah heard Mummy tell her friend that Cordelia had once had an important job and travelled the world. Then she'd inherited this huge old house, part medieval nunnery and part Georgian mansion, and it was where she now lived, in isolated splendour. The grounds of the house led down to 3 narrow bridges and the place where the 2 rivers met. Daddy had explained it was why the town was named Thetford, but she'd tuned out when he'd started a history lesson. He could save those for his students at the university where he taught. All she and Emily cared about was that every year they spent the month of August at the hall with their parents, while Daddy was on holidays. Here they had access to the extensive gardens, and beyond those, the wilderness which ran down to the river. And this year, Daddy had bought an old tyre in the car, saying that he'd fix up a swing so they could fly out over the river. Mummy had already decreed that Emily wouldn't be allowed to play on it unless one of the adults was present. But as she was 11, almost 12, Sarah would be allowed to play on it whenever she wanted. Not that she'd ever be alone to do so. Her sister followed her everywhere. "I'm glad the good weather has kept until we could get here and enjoy it." Mummy pushed her oversized sunglasses onto her face and kissed Cordelia somewhere in the air close to her cheek. Leaving Daddy to carry the rest of the luggage, they trooped inside, the cool interior of the house a contrast to the brightness outside. Sarah and Emily immediately began to skip around the spacious entrance hall, which was originally the nave of the nuns' chapel, another history lesson from Daddy, with its austere walls, pale sandstone blocks soaring up to beamed rafters high above. The floor still had stones dedicated to 2 abbesses sunk into it, and despite her joyous dancing, Sarah was careful to hop over them, believing it would somehow be unlucky to step on them. Emily had no such concern, paying little attention to where her feet landed. The adults disappeared towards the back of the house, where the tall-ceilinged Georgian rooms were. Mummy was carrying a bag which clinked with the sound of bottles. Their holiday was starting as it always did. Their parents would spend all day and evening drinking wine, whilst Cordelia made sure she and Emily were fed at regular intervals. That was where any adult supervision ended. With Emily following, Sarah carried their suitcases up the narrow staircase at the back of the hall, and then along the endless corridors to their room, the one they always stayed in. It was in the former convent part of the building, but the sunlight from 2 tall, Gothic-arched stone mullioned windows with leaded lights stopped it feeling gloomy. The sunshine now pouring in shone on the dust motes, which their exuberant entry had disturbed. The familiar twin cast iron beds were covered in new matching yellow duvets, which looked more grown up than the Disney ones they'd had previously. And they brightened the oak-panelled wall behind the beds. Emily was pouting in disappointment to discover that Mickey and Minnie hadn't greeted them, and she immediately ran back downstairs to request the old covers were reinstated. Sarah began to unpack her clothes into the tall chest of drawers she always used, shoving items in haphazardly. Along the top was her collection of items found in the garden still left from the year before. Going to the window, she gazed down at the glorious sight of the manicured lawns stretching into the distance, all tended by Cordelia's gardener, Pete, who was permanently at her beck and call. The roses set out in 6 big flower beds were a mass of colour, all shades of white and cream and yellow. Sarah knew how wonderful they smelled, filling the air in the garden with their delicate scent. From where she stood, she could also see the hammock, shaded by the boughs of a pair of rowan trees, from which it hung, and her mind went to the library books she'd brought with her. The summer stretched out, in a miasma of blissful, sun-warmed fun, and a smile widened across her face. Later, just as she'd expected, the evening descended into her parents drinking copious amounts until they were almost asleep. And by the time the sun set and long shadows stretched out across the lawn, Cordelia was the one who hurried the 2 girls to bed. As she lay awake, listening to an owl softly calling from somewhere in the woods and the regular sigh of Emily breathing gently in her sleep, it was as perfect to Sarah as it could possibly be. She had, she considered, arrived home. Chapter 5, 1571. Philip and I remained at Arundel for 5 days after our wedding, before riding to Howard House, which lay just outside London's city walls. It was many miles, and the journey from Sussex was long and arduous. In deference to mine and Kate's lack of riding expertise, we travelled at a leisurely pace, but I felt no gratitude. The day after the wedding, I'd had to wave goodbye to my sisters and grandmother as they began their return journey back to Norfolk. With every ounce of my being, I wished I was going with them, to a familiar place, which, although held painful memories, was also filled with love. I doubted there'd be any of that at my new destination, and most of our travels, broken up by overnight stops at various houses belonging to friends of my father-in-law, where Kate and I stayed in a room of our own, was made through a veil of tears. Even Philip, who during the time we spent together had shown himself to be a funny and entertaining companion, kindly rode alongside me instead of riding on ahead with his father, trying to distract me by pointing out the deer and hawks inhabiting the rolling Surrey hills. But his best efforts couldn't cajole me from my misery. Finally, we arrived in London. Despite my gloom, I sat up straighter and looked around as we approached the bustle of this great city. I'd read plenty of descriptions of it in news pamphlets, and despite my woes, I felt a spark of excitement to see it for myself. As we rode across London Bridge, the tall buildings along it crowding out the light, I looked down at the brown, swirling water of the Thames and was immediately struck by the difference from the clear rivers beside my home, where you could sit in silence and hear the rush of water dancing over the stones below, catching the grasses as it raced by. Where the quiet was punctuated by the angry squawks of ducks and geese who nested beside the shallows, and where the stillness of the heron watching and waiting for the flash of a fish was a familiar sight. Here, the crowds of people going about their daily business were overwhelming as they darted in front of my horse, causing it to dance sideways as I fought to control it. This was completely different to anything I had imagined. Philip shouted to his father, who was attempting to push his way through the people ahead to allow the entourage to pass, and a young yeoman guard, Luke, was sent back to take hold of my horse's bridle and lead it. The noise of hawkers shouting and the smell of hot food mixed with excrement and the dirty water from below, as all manner of things were thrown into the fast-flowing river, was so overwhelming I thought I would pass out. For a moment, I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, we were almost at the other end of the bridge, and my eyes spied something attached to the walls. Tall pikes, which swayed slightly in the wind, topped by round, black balls of tar. It was only as we drew level, and I could see teeth gleaming in rictus grins, that I realised they were the heads of those executed as traitors. My stomach churned, and immediately I looked down at my fingers twisting in my horse's mane, keeping my eyes averted until we'd passed beneath the gate and were within the city walls. Passing along Gracechurch Street with its cluster of churches, several bells rang in a musical discord to chime the hour. Already it was mid-afternoon, and as the Duke had decided we wouldn't stop for dinner, my stomach growled. It was many hours since we'd broken our fast. A wide street, which Luke informed me was called Cheapside, was lined with stalls selling all kinds of food, and I breathed in the scent of warm bread and pies and roasting meat. Just for once, I was thankful the Duke's position would ensure food was produced the moment we arrived at our destination. I sincerely hoped it wouldn't be much further. After 30 more minutes riding, where the city gave way to green fields reminding me of Norfolk, we finally arrived. Howard House had previously been known as Charterhouse, another religious establishment dissolved, and the building subsequently given to the Duke. He seemed to make a habit of acquiring properties due to the misfortune of others. The impressive entrance porch led into a great hall, with a huge sandstone fireplace and wood panelling around the walls. My father-in-law was quick to show off the large screen decorated with fashionable motifs that we walked beneath, which he'd recently had installed. His initials were engraved on it, as though someone may visit and not know which illustrious person lived there. Philip was eager to give me a tour of my new home, but after our journey, I apologised and informed him it would have to wait for another day before asking to be shown to my rooms. Philip took me to one side. "I instructed my father you must have your own apartment here," he told me. "You are still too young to be in the marriage bed, and I would not have you forced to undertake that yet. We have many years ahead, and I will be away in Cambridge soon. We can grow to know each other slowly when I visit." I leant my head against the soft velvet of his doublet for a moment. He was so different from the monster that his father was, and I felt a spasm of guilt about the vow of retribution I had made for George. I may inadvertently bring Philip down too, although I would try my very best not to do so. "Thank you," I whispered. He smiled and nodded. "I cannot promise you your rooms will be spacious," he said. "I sent word to Gilbert to prepare them, but he will have chosen where you are to be. Perhaps you'll be squashed with your maid in one of the cramped monk cells which remain here." I felt his chest rumble with laughter, and stepping back, I swatted his chest with my palm. "If that happens, I will be arranging an exchange for your rooms the moment you are on the road to Cambridge," I replied, not able to stop the smile which played at the corner of my mouth. "Send word if you are displeased," he told me, "or speak with my grandmother, Lady Frances. She appears imperious, for she holds an important position as a dowager duchess, but she is truthful and kind, and she will ensure you are equipped for your new life here." He gently kissed my cheek before disappearing into the bowels of the building until he was swallowed up by the shadowy corridor. I felt a pang of disappointment that I was unlikely to have much time with him before he left. As I had been warned, my rooms were indeed small. My bedchamber overlooked the courtyard and entrance at the front of the building, whilst the parlour window had an outlook to the old cloisters. It was a pleasant view, but not the one I was used to, and once again a wash of homesickness flooded over me, taking my breath away. Curling my hands into tight fists, my nails dug into the soft flesh of my palms. I would not keep thinking that way, I told myself. I would embrace everything this new life could offer. It was time to harness that which stirred deep within me. I was known, indeed complained about, at Barnham Cross for my stubborn attitude and my ability to achieve what I desired whatever the cost. And now I would apply that strength to what I must do. "Well, this is all very different," I said to Kate, catching her hands and whirling round on the spot with her. "What new life shall we have here? All of London, this great city at our disposal. It seems so big and unfriendly." Kate's mouth was starting to turn down at the corners, but I wouldn't let her nerves spoil my excitement. "You have me. I am your friend," I admonished. Although I agreed silently that whilst it didn't feel homely yet, I was sure it soon would. Once I'd stamped my own position within our new surroundings. Within minutes of our arrival, with the Duke's steward Gilbert still at the front of the building, shouting at the servants who were carrying the luggage and furniture that had travelled with us inside, a knock at the door revealed a young maid. Her eyes were cast down, and she was carrying a bowl of warm water scented with sprigs of dried rosemary. She placed it with a piece of linen for drying onto the top of a press in front of the windows. "Mistress, I am to ask if you require any sustenance." Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. I was keen that the staff would know that I was not as grand as my father-in-law, nor as discourteous as I suspected he often was. "Thank you," I replied. "Both myself and Kate have not eaten since this morning, so we would indeed like some food, together with a jug of ale, please." The young girl nodded and disappeared out of the room. I splashed my face and hands with the fresh-smelling water and then bade Kate to do the same whilst it was still warm. We were both dirty from travelling, and our gowns would need to be cleansed of the dust they'd collected. Before we left Arundel, I insisted Kate was properly attired. She might be a servant, but it would not show the Duke in a good light if a member of his household staff wasn't appropriately dressed. Thankfully, as appearances were everything to him, he'd readily agreed, and Kate had been provided with new shifts, kirtles, and a riding gown. I too had many new clothes, as nothing I'd ever possessed before. I'd previously owned just 4 gowns, one of which was my black damask worn for mourning. But now, including my wedding attire, I had a further 6, which had been sewn by the Duke's tailors, together with several pairs of new sleeves, silk hose, and soft lawn shifts. Even my old boots had been replaced with ones of the softest leather, together with velvet slippers for inside the house, and lambskin gloves for if I wished to go riding. I honestly couldn't imagine ever wanting to do that again. What a shame the Duke hadn't thought to furnish my sisters and me over the years with better, warmer clothes to combat the chill of our Norfolk home. The maid reappeared with 2 others, all bearing platters of food and jugs of ale, which they laid on the table, before curtsying and leaving once again. It had all been undertaken in silence. "Thank goodness," Kate said, placing the garments she was holding onto the bed. "Let me help you with some food." She moved towards the platters and poured some beer, holding it out to me. "When it is the 2 of us in here, please, Kate, just be as you were in Norfolk," I told her. "You do not have to wait on me as the other servants expect to do. Yes, you are my maid, but foremost, you are my friend. Come now, let us help ourselves to food and sit together and eat." Using a spoon, I placed some roast goose and veal on a trencher and added a piece of the white manchip bread, which was so much finer than the rough brown alternative we'd been used to. There were dishes of purple carrots and artichokes in a shiny, pungent sauce, and a small 2-handled cup containing a saffron-infused caudle sweetened with honey. My anxiety was quietened for a few minutes as we both tucked in, but I knew this was just a momentary pause. I had a mission to undertake here in London. It would be dangerous and probably life-threatening, but I would not fail. I had made a promise to myself, and I never reneged on a promise. My father-in-law had no idea of my plans, and nor would he until it was too late and his hours were numbered. Then he would know why retribution was mine. Chapter 6, 2025. Carrying her suitcase and backpack into the house, Sarah found Amanda waiting in the hall for her. "Cordelia asked me to air a room for you the moment she'd sealed her letter," she explained as she led the way to the stairs. "So convinced was she that you'd come." She had more foresight than me then. I wasn't certain until this morning that I would, Sarah admitted. At the rear of the hall were the stairs. They had at one point led to the convent dormitories and sola, once the private chamber of the abbess, and now Cordelia's room, and nobody had ever thought to move them to a more prominent place, so here they remained. Having climbed the stairs, she'd forgotten how steep they were, or perhaps it was just because she was now older that they felt so. Sarah followed Amanda across half landings and up more stairs along the familiar corridors, still lined with dark portraits of austere people who'd lived centuries before. Her heart began to thump. Please, God, don't let her have put me in the same room. She could see the closed door ahead, the past lurking behind it, waiting to drag her back to that summer, to engulf her in the horror lodged permanently within her, waiting for any chance to creep back out. Cordelia insisted you have her old room. Amanda opened a door to her left and stepped inside. Sarah let her breath out slowly as she walked into a room she'd barely ever been in, somewhere that was out of bounds to small children. Her room? She questioned. Where does she sleep now? The stairs are too much for her now. We've set up a bedroom in the dining room, and the old cloakroom beside the kitchen has been converted into a wet room. It's much more convenient, and I'm happy not to have to keep walking up and down those steps every day. She chuckled. You've got young legs, though. You'll be okay. Dinner will be in the drawing room. You may have noticed there's now a small dining table in there. We tend to eat together, it's easier. If there's anything you need, just let me know. Thank you. Sarah smiled at her. You've been very kind getting all this ready for me. You really shouldn't have gone to so much bother. I'm very grateful, though. Nonsense. Cordelia says you're staying several weeks, so you'll need somewhere pleasant to escape to when you want to be on your own. Can't be easy coming back here. Cordelia told me briefly of what happened when you were a child. Living in the village, of course I knew of rumours, but nothing more. No, she agreed. I'm still not sure I've done the right thing, but I want to help her, so here I am. She was very kind to me when I was a child, when I needed her, and now she needs me. I don't know how long for, but I must do it and put my own thoughts aside. Sarah didn't add that there had been a time when Cordelia was the